first thing that comes to mind is how you said if there's two people that are twins raised together, or mice, as you mentioned. Now, would the epigenetics be laying on top of the DNA and only begin to encode after birth, or are humans born with different epigenetics from the get-go?
So humans are born with their own epigenetic modifications from the get-go, but initially they're very much driven by genetics and the environment in the womb. So if you look at identical twins when they're born and you look at their epigenetic modifications, they're very, very similar. The older the twins get, the less similar those epigenetic modifications become. So they start diverging. Their genetic stays exactly the same, but their epigenetic starts to shift. But we are all born with particular epigenetic modifications on our genes, and those seem to be very highly influenced by things that happen in the first trimester of pregnancy. Those kind of set certain types of epigenetic modifications essentially for the rest of our lives.
Interesting. And has any research been done on what exactly it is? Like, is it a nutrition protocol? Is it perhaps if there's any sort of trauma that's being, experienced by the parent, Mozart or Robbie Williams in the womb? Like, what's
if you listen to Mozart because you like Mozart, not because you think it's going to make your baby smarter.
Right. I remember that was an article that came out years and years ago, and I'm sure there's so many classical music haters that were just like, well, baby's going to be smart. Baby's going to be smart.
Absolutely. And I suspect the baby just came out going, God, turn the volume down on this ruddy music.
Right.
It's certainly things like nutrition, we think, have a big impact. Now, it's possible that stress for the mother may also have a big impact, simply because that will lead to her having more stress hormones circulating in her blood, and a percentage of those can cross the placenta. And so they may affect what's happening in the baby. It's not the same thing as saying she's psychologically stressed and it has some magic effect on the stress levels of the baby. We do know that many conditions, particularly chronic conditions, are really affected by the first 3 months in utero. So that's why it's so important for women to have access to good nutrition, to have good access to healthcare, ideally not to be smoking or drinking alcohol in excess. What we never had before was an understanding of why that mattered. Why would something that happens for the first 12 weeks of embryonic life, why could that affect you for the rest of your life? Now we understand that it's almost certainly because epigenetic modifications are being established, which influence how you do things like metabolize food for the rest of your life.
That's really interesting. That reminds me of a conversation I had years ago with a wife of a friend, and she was a fetal alcohol nurse or something. I can't remember the exact title, but she was telling me that sometimes it's not even people that are alcoholics per se. It's, let's say, people in their 20s or 30s that are maybe going out and partying, and they happen to have a bout of 3 months of a lot of drinking, and the mother doesn't know that she's pregnant.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And it's really interesting that we often think that there's only the extremes that are dangerous for us, where we think like, okay, well, if you drink too much alcohol while you're pregnant, well, then your child's going to have fetal alcohol syndrome or all these other problems, etc. But it seems we forget to consider that even like a minimum dose is going to have a net negative impact over not having a glass of wine or not, having too much of any sort of substance. So are they still trying to figure out like that?
They are still trying. The scientific community is still trying to figure that out. And there are possibly certain substances where there is no such thing as a safe level. Radiation and cigarette smoke, for example, there's no point at which you go, yeah, that's fine. Just a little bit of a radiation or just the occasional cigarette. Alcohol's a complex one because, as you say, women often don't know that they're pregnant. And I'm very wary of creating the impression that women spend their entire lives only waiting to be pregnant. And then when they're pregnant, we basically hammer the life out of them for everything we say they've done wrong for their baby. We have to be really careful to avoid that. The problem is that, as you say, it might just be that you're really unlucky, that you have, a month where you're feeling rubbish or where everybody has a birthday party and you're out drinking more than is sensible in health terms. And that happens to coincide with a critical developmental window for your fetus.
Right.
But to be honest, you can kind of get around that by the idea of, well, keep drinking within normal levels generally. Just take into account the health advice. However, I have to say that as somebody who's 59, I'm much better at doing that now than I was when I was 25.
Right. Yeah, I think we all were. Yeah, I think we all were. Yeah. Like how many times I look back and talking with some friends were like, that was unnecessary. That was unnecessary.
That was not necessary.
Some of those evenings. But so I'm not sure if you're aware, there's a podcast called the Andrew Huberman Lab podcast.
No, I don't know that one.
And I believe he's a neurobiologist. I'm going to get it wrong, but he's a scientist and runs a lab in Stanford. And what he's been really beating the drum quite heavily on alcohol minimum dose on Twitter and otherwise, saying that it really seems that a healthy level is 1 to 2 drinks per week. And that even anything above that, he goes, but even less than that is better. And so it's an interesting conversation because we're thinking like we've taken for granted that alcohol is really intertwined into the fabric of our life, nowhere more present than the UK, for example. And it's really interesting because you imagine how many other things impact a fetus's development, and even after the baby's born. And if it's like stress in the home environment, if it's really nutrient lacking foods, it really can impact the developmental health of just the brain trying to grow and become everything that it potentially could be. So when we're growing up, are they being able to establish what has more impact on the epigenetics moving forward, or is that still a bit of a black box?
It's still a bit of a black box. And one of the things you have to bear in mind is that humans are a terrible experimental species because we're genetically very outbred. We have big environmental variation. People are not desperately keen on offering you bits of their brain for study while they're still alive.
I've heard that.
We're a terrible species.
Right.
Yeah. So you do have to be careful because some studies are based on extrapolation from rodents, which are the closest thing we can get, or at least the closest thing we can use convincingly. So you have to be very careful about extrapolating. Then the other problem that we have is actually most of the good data on, that's actually on humans is epidemiological data, where, you can study the alcohol intake and you can see what the long-term consequences are for offspring, for example. The trouble is that's a very long way from showing that those consequences are due to epigenetic changes. The epigenetic changes are a very good hypothesis, but I'd be a bit rash if I said it can all be explained by epigenetics. So we have this mechanistic gap. We can make extrapolations, and they can be quite reasonable extrapolations, or they can be absolutely batcrap crazy extrapolations. We can do either.
Gotcha.
And the problem is that it's very difficult to unravel all of that. So to be honest, as an individual, what I always revert to is the epidemiological information, which is, if epidemiology tells me it is very unhealthy to have the kind of levels of alcohol consumption that are typical in the UK, for example, because we have a big dysfunctional relationship with alcohol as a population. I follow the epidemiology that says this is a very bad idea to drink that much. Excuse me. And I worry about the mechanism later. So I tend to go that way around. So we don't always understand the reasons why things are unhealthy. I can always come up with a great hypothesis for why it's epigenetics, but I could be completely wrong. That's one of the problems with epigenetics. You can always come up with lovely hypotheses that you can't test. So what's the point?
Right. Well,